The year was 1893, and the sky above the northern timber valleys did not snow. It shattered. It was the winter that history books would later try to forget, a season where the thermometer plunged so violently that the sap inside the ancient pines froze, causing the trunks to explode in the dead of night with the sound of cannon fire. Up on the affluent ridges of Oakhaven, the self-proclaimed masters of industry and commerce were learning a terrifying, ancient truth. Arrogance has a freezing point, and nature does not accept paper money as negotiation. Inside the sprawling, three-story Victorian mansion of the Sterling Pearson family, the imported silk wallpapers were peeling away, heavy with creeping white frost. These were men who believed that human engineering, fueled by limitless wealth, had finally conquered the earth. They had installed magnificent, complex cast-iron boilers in their basements, marvels of the modern age. They had purchased tons of premium Pennsylvania coal at a staggering $300 a season, a sum that could buy a vast farm, believing that such an expense guaranteed their comfort. But the storm of 1893 was not merely cold. It was a horizontal hurricane of ice and moisture. The driving, relentless blizzard had flooded their poorly designed, masonry-lined coal chutes weeks prior. Now, that $300 mountain of premium coal was a solid, useless block of freezing black sludge. Wet coal cannot burn. It only smokes and suffocates. Down in the basements, the magnificent cast-iron boilers went quiet. As the ambient temperature plummeted, the water sitting idle inside those complex iron pipes began to follow the inescapable laws of physics. Water expands when it turns to ice. At precisely 3 in the morning, the heavy iron radiators throughout the mansions began to crack, bursting open with violent, jagged fractures, rendering the entire expensive heating system permanently dead. The elite of Oakhaven, wrapped in imported velvet and shivering violently beneath their high, ornate ceilings, were trapped in a gilded icebox. Yet, down in the valley, in the very shadow of the ridge where the winds gathered their most lethal velocity, there was silence, there was peace, and there was a steady, radiating, deeply comforting heat. Here, hidden beneath the howling white chaos, stood a structure that the men on the hill had openly mocked. It was a low, earth-bermed shelter, its roof constructed entirely of overlapping slabs of scavenged birch and cedar bark. The total cost of this dwelling was precisely $6, the price of a single, well-tempered iron axe head. Nothing more. Inside this humble earthen sanctuary, Tamsin sat in a hand-carved rocking chair, a cup of steeped pine needle tea resting in her hands. The ambient temperature in her small home was a perfectly stable, unyielding 70 degrees. On a small, woven rug near the stone hearth, her 7-year-old son, Bram, and her 4-year-old daughter, Nettie, were deeply asleep. Their chests rose and fell in slow, rhythmic breaths, their faces flushed and warm, sweating slightly under the weight of a single, simple wool blanket. They were safe. Tamsin did not have a cast-iron boiler. She did not have a mountain of expensive coal. What she had was an ancestral understanding of thermodynamics and the humility to listen to the forest. Her fire was astonishingly small, just a few modest logs of ash and oak, but it burned with a mesmerizing, almost translucent blue-orange flame. There was no smoke, no popping, no wasted energy. The wood was so profoundly, perfectly dry that every single ounce of its mass was converted directly into pure thermal energy. The heat radiated outward, striking the thick, packed earth walls of her cabin, which acted as a massive thermal battery, absorbing the warmth and slowly reflecting it back into the room. Outside, the brutal wind battered against her roof, but the overlapping bark did not fail. Bark is nature's ultimate hydrophobic membrane, designed by millions of years of evolution to protect the living tissue of trees from freezing moisture. Instead of fighting the wind, the low aerodynamic curve of Tamsin's roof allowed the blizzard to glide right over it, the snow piling up on the edges and ironically creating an additional layer of natural insulation. She listened to the distant, muffled roar of the storm, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, not from the cold, but from the heavy memory of how she had arrived at this moment. The warmth she enjoyed tonight was born from the cold cruelty of the town 6 months prior. Tamsin remembered the blazing heat of the late summer when she first arrived in Oakhaven, a grieving widow with 2 exhausted children, pulling a wooden cart containing everything they owned. She had sought refuge, only to find a community whose hearts were harder than the currency they worshipped. She remembered the bitter laughter of the timber barons. Above all, she remembered the cold, judging eyes of Reverend Aldous Vance, a man who equated poverty with a lack of divine favor, and who saw her quiet independence as an insult to his authority. As the guardian of these forgotten stories, standing at the crossroads of history and human nature, I must ask you, have you ever felt the crushing weight of being underestimated? Have you ever stood quietly while those with money and titles mocked your methods, only to later watch the world prove you right? Before we step back into the fading summer light to witness the cruelty that forced Tamsin to build her masterpiece, I ask that you leave your mark upon our community. Subscribe to this channel, leave your like to fuel our digital hearth, and share this gathering with those who understand the value of true wisdom. And please, tell me in the comments below, from which city, state, or country are you watching today? Is there a storm gathering outside your window, and are you ready for the winter to come? 6 months before the sky shattered, Oakhaven was a town drunk on its own prosperity, and Tamsin was nothing but a fragile target in their eyes. The tragedy of the modern civilized man is the deeply ingrained delusion that a heavy coin purse can somehow bribe the forces of nature. Oakhaven, in the late summer of 1893, was a glittering monument to this exact arrogance. The timber barons and merchants had conquered the valley, replacing ancient forests with paved streets, steam-powered sawmills, and massive, drafty mansions built of stone and imported glass. They measured their worth by the sheer tonnage of coal they could afford to burn, utterly disconnected from the rhythm of the earth beneath their polished leather boots. Into this theater of vanity walked Tamsin. It was a suffocatingly hot afternoon in late August when she crossed the town limits, her blistered hands gripping the wooden handles of a weathered handcart. She was a widow, her husband claimed by a swift and brutal mining fever a year prior, leaving her with nothing but debts she did not owe and the crushing, sacred responsibility of 2 young lives. Inside the cart, resting on a pile of threadbare wool blankets, were 7-year-old Bram and 4-year-old Nettie. Nettie's breathing was shallow, carrying a slight, persistent wheeze, a lingering ghost of a winter cold that Tamsin was desperately trying to outrun. Tamsin possessed no gold, no bank drafts, and no pedigree. Her entire earthly fortune was contained within that cart: a cast-iron pot, a few yards of canvas, a small bag of heirloom seeds, and her most vital possession, a hand-forged, high-carbon steel axe. She had purchased it from a traveling blacksmith for exactly $6. It was a perfectly balanced tool, its edge honed to a mirror finish, designed not for destruction, but for precise, harmonious work with timber. To the wealthy elite passing her in their horse-drawn carriages, she was an eyesore, an uncomfortable reminder of the poverty they believed they had legislated out of existence. Desperate to secure a safe harbor before the autumn winds arrived, Tamsin parked her cart near the steps of the grand, newly constructed parish in the center of town. She was seeking permission to occupy a worthless, rocky strip of land on the far edge of the valley basin, a place too steep for farming and too close to the wild tree line for the tastes of the elite. It was there she met Reverend Aldous Vance. Reverend Vance was a towering man draped in spotless, suffocating black broadcloth. His silver pocket watch ticked loudly against his chest, a constant mechanical reminder that in Oakhaven, time was money, and both belonged strictly to men like him. Vance did not look at Tamsin with compassion. He looked at her as a problem to be managed. To him, poverty was not a circumstance. It was a moral failing, a visible lack of divine favor. "The land at the valley's edge is unforgiving, woman," Vance proclaimed, his voice booming across the cobblestones, drawing the attention of passing merchants, including the wealthy Mr. Sterling Pearson. "You will not survive a fortnight when the frost sets in, but the parish is merciful. I shall offer you a place in the church basement." Tamsin knew of those basements. They were dark, entirely devoid of sunlight, with walls weeping with subterranean dampness. For a child with Nettie's delicate lungs, living in that cold, moldering darkness would be a swift death sentence. And there was, of course, a price. "In exchange for this charity," Vance continued, his eyes narrowing, "you will scrub the sanctuary floors, launder the altar linens, and wash the garments of the town's leading families. You shall earn your keep through absolute humility." Tamsin looked at the imposing stone church, then down at her coughing daughter. Her motivation was never her own pride. It was the biological, fiercely protective instinct of a mother. She needed dry air, the healing warmth of a real fire, and the dignity of the open sky. "I thank you for the offer, Reverend," Tamsin said, her voice quiet but possessing the unyielding strength of mountain granite. "But the basement air is too damp for my children. I ask only to use the scrap land by the tree line. I will build my own shelter. I have my axe, and the forest will provide the rest." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the steps. Reverend Vance blinked, his face flushing with insulted authority. Mr. Sterling Pearson, pausing on his way to the bank, let out a loud, theatrical bark of laughter. "Build a shelter?" Pearson scoffed, stepping closer to inspect her meager cart. "With what? Mud and twigs? Are you a badger, madam, or simply mad?" "I will build an earth-bermed lodge," Tamsin replied evenly, refusing to lower her gaze. "And I will roof it with overlapping birch and cedar bark. I will construct a slatted shed to dry my wood using the valley wind. It is an old way. It costs nothing but labor." The mockery that erupted from the gathered elite was swift and merciless. They did not just insult her poverty. They aggressively attacked her logic, deeply offended that a destitute woman dared to speak of engineering. "A bark roof?" Reverend Vance spat, pointing a trembling finger at her cart. "Bark is dead wood. The moment the deep freeze hits, that bark will become as brittle as spun glass. The first heavy snow will crush it, and the wind will tear it to shreds. You are attempting to build a savage's grave for those innocent children." "Mr." Pearson shook his head, looking at Tamsin with sheer contempt. "A slatted woodshed with gaps in the walls? You intend to let the snow and wind blow directly onto your firewood? You truly are a fool. Listen to me, woman. I have just paid $300 for a ton of premium anthracite coal and a state-of-the-art cast-iron boiler. I have employed masons and engineers. That is how one survives the winter. Not with a $6 axe and the delusions of a peasant. You cannot cheat the cold with garbage scavenged from the dirt." The crowd murmured in agreement. In their minds, thermal security was a luxury product that must be purchased at a high premium. The idea that a marginalized widow could achieve warmth for exactly $6 was not just laughable. It was a philosophical threat to their entire economic worldview. If you refuse the church's charity and march out to that tree line, Vance delivered his final, chilling ultimatum, leaning in close so Tamsin could smell the peppermint and privilege on his breath. You are entirely on your own. When the blizzards come, and you realize your little bark joke has failed, do not come weeping to our doors. We will not open them for a woman who chooses the mud over civilized society. Tamsin did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at the grand, drafty Victorian houses lining the ridge, then looked down at her $6 axe. She knew something they did not. She knew that iron and coal rely on complex, fragile systems, but nature relies on immutable laws. Without another word, Tamsin took the handles of her cart, turned her back on the wealthiest men in the county, and began the slow, solitary walk toward the dark, unwelcoming edge of the forest. The elite of Oakhaven watched her go, shaking their heads at her supposed ignorance, entirely unaware that in 6 months' time they would be marching through waist-deep snow to beg on their knees for the very blueprints they had just called a joke. When Tamsin reached the stony, undesirable edge of the valley, the cacophony of Oakhaven's steam whistles and clattering carriages faded, replaced by the ancient, solemn silence of the deep woods. Here, the earth was not a commodity to be bought and sold. It was a living, breathing entity willing to shelter those who understood its language. She had exactly 2 months before the first killing frost. She had 2 small children whose survival depended entirely on her hands, and she had her $6 axe. While the elite down in the valley were busy paying exorbitant fees to bricklayers to construct massive, uninsulated walls of solid masonry, a material that practically bleeds heat into the winter air, Tamsin began to dig. She did not build on the earth, she built into it. Choosing a natural south-facing slope that would capture the low winter sun, Tamsin spent the first 2 weeks excavating a deep semicircle directly into the hillside. The wealthy merchants of Oakhaven, occasionally riding past on their expensive thoroughbreds to inspect their timber borders, would stop just long enough to point and laugh at the dirt-stained widow. "Look at her, digging a grave for herself while she still breathes," mocked Mr. Pearson during one of his rides. "The earth is freezing cold. She is burying those children in a tomb of mud." But Pearson's arrogance blinded him to a fundamental law of thermodynamics. The ambient air above ground might drop to a lethal 20 degrees below zero during a blizzard, but beneath the frost line, the earth maintains a constant, stable temperature of around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. By berming her small cabin into the hillside, Tamsin was utilizing the Earth's massive thermal inertia. The millions of tons of soil surrounding her shelter acted as a colossal, natural thermal battery. It would absorb the heat from her small fire during the day and slowly, steadily radiate that heat back into the living space throughout the freezing night. Once the earthen walls were packed and smoothed, Tamsin turned to the forest for her materials. She used her 6 axe to fell straight, sturdy poles of fallen deadwood, lashing them together with soaked spruce roots to form the skeletal frame of her roof. But the true genius of her engineering, the very thing that would later save the lives of the men who mocked her, was the waterproof membrane she designed to cover it. Tamsin sought out the massive, ancient paper birches and the fallen cedars. Using the razor-sharp edge of her high-carbon steel axe, she carefully scored the bark and peeled it away in massive, thick sheets. Bark is a miracle of natural engineering. It is rich in suberin, a waxy, highly hydrophobic substance designed by millions of years of evolution to protect the inner cambium of the tree from freezing rain and rot. She laid the sheets of bark in overlapping rows, starting from the bottom of the roof pitch and working her way to the top, securing them with heavy stones and cross poles. Reverend Vance, watching from the comfort of his heated carriage one afternoon, sneered at the sight. "A roof of peeled bark," he proclaimed to his driver, loud enough for Tamsin's children to hear. "It is a savage's parlor trick. The moment the deep winter freeze hits, that dead wood will become as brittle as spun glass. The ice will shatter it, and the moisture will rot it from the inside out. You cannot defy the elements with woodland scraps, woman." But the Reverend understood nothing of cellular biology. The bark was not dead wood. It was a flexible, water-repelling armor. Because Tamsin overlapped the pieces like the scales of a fish, there were no nails to rust, no rigid joints to snap when the temperature dropped. The roof could flex and breathe under the weight of the snow. Furthermore, beneath the outer bark, Tamsin created a secondary inner ceiling of woven pine boughs. Between the pine boughs and the bark roof lay a 6-inch gap of trapped, stagnant air. This was the principle of the thermal break. Dead air is one of the poorest conductors of heat on the planet. This microscopic gap ensured that the precious kinetic energy of her indoor fire could not transfer through the roof to the freezing outside air. Tamsin was achieving for $6 what the town's elite could not achieve with $300 of coal: absolute thermal retention. Yet, the most vital battle of winter survival is not just trapping heat, it is generating it efficiently. And to generate heat, one needs dry fuel. Green, freshly cut wood is roughly 50% water by weight. If you attempt to burn wet wood, the laws of physics exact a heavy toll. 40% of the wood's potential thermal energy is instantly wasted just boiling off the internal moisture, resulting in a cold, smoking, inefficient fire that coats the chimney in dangerous creosote. The wealthy men of Oakhaven stored their expensive firewood and coal in deep, solid stone basements, believing that locking the fuel away behind thick walls protected it. Instead, they were creating stagnant, damp tombs where moisture pooled and never escaped. Tamsin built something entirely different. Next to her earthen shelter, she constructed a woodshed that became the ultimate source of the town's cruelest jokes. She built a sturdy frame, but instead of solid walls, she nailed thin, vertical branches to the sides, deliberately leaving a 2-inch gap between every single slat. She stacked her scavenged green wood inside. When the town's blacksmith, a man who prided himself on his solid ironwork, rode past, he erupted into roaring laughter. "You build a wall with holes to keep the winter out?" the blacksmith shouted, pointing his heavy hammer at her shed. "You leave your firewood exposed to the open wind and the driving snow? Are you completely devoid of reason, widow? A child knows a solid wall protects. You are letting the storm blow right onto your fuel." Tamsin did not stop swinging her axe. She simply wiped the sweat from her brow, looking at the blacksmith with eyes as calm and deep as a glacial lake. "I am not keeping the wind out," Tamsin said quietly. "I am putting it to work." She was not defying reason. She was harnessing fluid dynamics. By leaving calculated gaps in the walls of the woodshed, Tamsin was weaponizing the Venturi effect. When the brutal autumn winds slammed against the shed, the air was forced to squeeze through the narrow 2-inch vertical slits. As a fluid, in this case air, is forced through a constriction, its velocity rapidly accelerates and its pressure drops. Inside Tamsin's shed, the wind did not just blow. It roared through the gaps like miniature jet streams. This accelerated low-pressure air stripped the moisture away from the stacked green wood at an exponential rate. Any snow that blew inside was instantly sublimated by the violent, continuous airflow. While the elite's expensive fuel rotted in their stagnant, damp basements, Tamsin's scavenged wood was being flash-dried by the very winds the town feared. Within just 6 weeks, her green wood was bone-dry, lightweight, and ready to release 100% of its thermal energy. By the end of November, Tamsin's preparations were complete. Her hands were calloused. Her muscles ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. But as she sat inside her earth-bermed cabin, looking at her healthy, smiling children playing on the woven rug, she felt an absolute, unshakable peace. Outside, the last leaves of autumn were violently stripped from the trees. The sky turned the color of bruised iron. The barometer began to drop with a terrifying speed, signaling an atmospheric collapse of unprecedented proportions. Down in the valley, the 300 coal deliveries were being locked into damp basements. The massive cast-iron boilers were fired up, and the elite of Oakhaven poured themselves glasses of imported brandy, congratulating themselves on their untouchable wealth, completely oblivious to the fact that their modern miracles were about to become their tombs. The white hell was coming, and nature was about to audit their arrogance. It began on the twilight of December the 12th, not with a howl, but with a terrifying, apocalyptic drop in atmospheric pressure. The old lumberjacks called it a cyclonic bomb, a violent collision of Arctic air and trapped valley moisture. The mercury in the imported glass thermometers of Oakhaven plummeted past zero, diving into the lethal territory of 35 degrees below zero. The sky did not merely snow, it unleashed a horizontal ocean of frozen daggers driven by 60-mile-per-hour winds. Nature had arrived to audit the arrogance of men, and she brought no mercy for those who had forgotten her laws. Up on the affluent ridge, panic erupted within the Sterling Pearson mansion. The wealthy merchant, clad in imported silk and velvet, watched in absolute horror as his fortress of civilization began to betray him. He had paid a fortune for walls of solid, double-thick masonry, believing mass equaled warmth. But he did not understand the unforgiving physics of thermal bridging. Solid stone and brick are excellent conductors of temperature. Instead of keeping the cold out, the massive walls of his Victorian home acted as giant thermal wicks, aggressively sucking the sub-zero temperatures from the outside blizzard directly into his parlor. The expensive floral wallpaper frosted over, the glue freezing and peeling away in long, curled strips like dead skin. Down in the valley, nestled against the earth, there was only silence and a profound, golden warmth. Tamsin sat in her rocking chair, the rhythmic creak-creak, the only sound competing with the muffled wind outside. Her $6 bark roof was performing a symphony of passive engineering. Because she had built a low, aerodynamic curve, the violent winds did not slam into her walls. They glided smoothly over the top. The storm itself was unwittingly fortifying her home, depositing a thick, continuous layer of snow over the overlapping birch bark. Snow, trapped with millions of tiny air pockets, is a phenomenal natural insulator. Instead of crushing the flexible bark, the snow packed down, adding an impenetrable, freezing blanket that locked the interior heat perfectly inside the earthen berm. Back on the ridge, Mr. Pearson sprinted down to his sprawling basement, shouting for his servants to stoke the massive cast-iron boiler. But the air down there was damp and suffocating. The $300 mound of premium Pennsylvania coal, his absolute guarantee of survival, had been exposed to the subterranean moisture of his poorly ventilated stone cellar. The moisture had seeped deep into the coal dust, and as the ambient temperature of the house plummeted, that moisture froze solid. He was no longer looking at fuel. He was looking at a 3-ton glacier of black slag. When the servants desperately shoveled the damp, freezing chunks into the boiler, the fire choked. The wet coal hissed, spewing thick, toxic yellow smoke into the basement as it wasted all its thermal energy trying to boil off its own ice. The massive boiler, starved of heat, began to shudder and die. Inside Tamsin's earthen sanctuary, the temperature was a completely unyielding, luxurious 72 degrees. She did not need 3 tons of coal. She walked out to her slatted, foolish woodshed, shielded from the direct blast by the valley's curve, and easily retrieved an armful of scavenged ashwood. Because the Venturi effect had forced the autumn winds to flash dry the timber for months, the wood weighed almost nothing. It was pure, concentrated cellular energy. She placed 3 small logs onto the hearth. They ignited instantly, burning with a fierce, translucent blue-orange flame. There was 0 moisture to boil off, meaning 0 smoke and 0 wasted energy. The thick earthen walls behind the fire drank in the intense heat, glowing with a dry, radiant warmth that washed over Bram and Nettie, who were sleeping deeply, kicking off their wool blanket because they were too warm. Up in the center of town, Reverend Aldous Vance was experiencing a complete psychological and structural collapse. The magnificent stone parish, built to project dominance, was becoming a tomb. The basement, the very damp, moldering pit where he had coldly demanded Tamsin subject her children in the name of charity, had flooded with freezing groundwater and was now a solid sheet of black ice. As the ambient heat of the church evaporated through the uninsulated stained glass, the real terror began. The water sitting idle inside the church's expensive, rigid iron heating pipes began to freeze, and water, obeying the immutable laws of physics, expands by 9% when it turns to solid ice. Crack. Bang. The sound echoed through the town like rifle fire. Deep within the walls of the Sterling Pearson mansion, the church, and the homes of the 43 elite families, the rigid cast-iron pipes, incapable of flexing, violently shattered. Scalding steam and freezing water erupted into the parlors and bedrooms, instantly turning into black ice upon contact with the freezing floors. Their $300 heating systems were not just failing. They were actively destroying their homes from the inside out. The pendulum of justice swung with a brutal, terrifying speed. The elite of Oakhaven, the men who laughed at a $6 axe and sneered at the wisdom of the forest, found themselves wrapped in multiple layers of expensive, useless rugs, shivering uncontrollably. Their breath plumed in their own bedrooms. The ink in Reverend Vance's expensive fountain pen froze solid, shattering the glass vial. Mr. Pearson's pocket watch, a symbol of his control over time, seized up as the delicate internal oils froze stiff. They had millions of dollars in bank drafts locked in their iron safes, but nature does not accept paper money. They could not eat their gold, and they could not burn their pride. As the white hell raged into its 3rd relentless day, the ambient temperature inside the mansions dropped to a fatal 10 degrees. Frostbite began to gnaw at the edges of their fingers and toes. The wealthy men and women of Oakhaven looked out their frosted, shattering windows, down toward the dark, undesirable tree line where they had banished the widow. They realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that all their wealth, all their arrogance, and all their modern engineering had failed them. To survive the night, they were going to have to walk into the storm. They were going to have to wade through the waist-deep snow, knock on a door made of branches, and fall to their knees before the very woman they had called a savage. It was the morning of the 4th day when the screaming winds of the white hell finally began to exhaust themselves, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavier than the storm itself. Oakhaven was buried. The grand Victorian mansions on the ridge resembled frosted tombstones, their expensive glass windows shattered by the internal explosions of frozen iron pipes. Inside those walls, the air was a lethal 10 degrees above zero. A procession of defeated men began to trudge through the waist-deep drifts, leading their freezing wives and shivering children down the ridge. At the front of this desperate march was Mr. Sterling Pearson, his imported velvet coat stiff as a wooden board with ice, and Reverend Aldous Vance, his towering figure hunched, his lungs burning with every agonizing breath of Arctic air. They had millions in the bank, yet they were walking as refugees in their own town. They marched toward the dark, undesirable tree line, driven by a primal, desperate hope that the widow they had banished had somehow survived. They expected to find a frozen grave. They expected the $6 bark roof to be crushed under the massive weight of the snowfall. Instead, as they crested the final snowdrift, they stopped dead in their tracks. There, nestled perfectly into the hillside, was Tamsin's earth-bermed cabin. The sweeping, aerodynamic curve of the overlapping birch bark roof was entirely intact, carrying a massive, insulating blanket of snow with effortless structural integrity. And there, rising from the small stone chimney, was a steady, beautiful plume of clear, shimmering heat. Not thick, choking black smoke from wet coal, but the clean, invisible distortion of perfectly dry wood undergoing total combustion. Mr. Pearson stumbled toward the foolish woodshed with the slatted walls. He fell to his knees in the snow, staring in absolute disbelief. The inside of the shed was completely free of snowdrifts. The violent winds had blown right through the gaps, creating the very Venturi effect Tamsin had calculated, keeping the remaining ashwood bone-dry and ready to burn. It was a masterpiece of fluid dynamics, built with scavenged branches. Trembling, his lips blue, and his pride entirely shattered, Reverend Vance approached the heavy wooden door. The man who had demanded Tamsin scrub the church floors for the charity of a moldering basement raised a frozen gloved fist and knocked. The door opened. The contrast was staggering. Tamsin stood before them, wearing a simple, clean cotton dress. Her face was flushed with warmth, her eyes calm and clear. Behind her, the earthen walls radiated a deep, luxurious, unyielding heat of 72 degrees. The smell of steeped pine needle tea and baking oat bread drifted out into the freezing air. On the woven rug, Bram and Nettie were quietly playing with carved wooden blocks, entirely untouched by the apocalypse outside. The blast of thermal energy hitting the freezing men felt like the breath of God. Reverend Vance opened his mouth to speak, to demand entry through his presumed authority, but the words died in his frozen throat. He looked at the warm, healthy children. He looked at the 6 dirhams resting by the hearth. And then, the towering, arrogant man sank slowly to his knees in the snow, tears of profound humiliation freezing on his cheeks. "We are freezing, Tamsin," Mr. Pearson whispered, his voice cracking, holding out a handful of useless, frozen banknotes. "The boilers are dead. The coal is ice. We were wrong. Please, in the name of mercy, let our children inside." This is the moment where a lesser soul would have gloated. A lesser mind would have demanded vengeance, leaving the arrogant to freeze in the graves they had dug with their own hubris. But Tamsin's motivation was never ego. She was a mother, a guardian of life, and she understood that true moral superiority does not require cruelty to validate itself. Tamsin looked at the freezing children of the elite, wrapped in useless silk. She gently pushed the frozen banknotes away from Pearson's hand. "Keep your money, Mr. Pearson. It will not burn," Tamsin said softly. She stepped aside, opening the door wide to the golden warmth. "Bring them in. The earth has enough heat for us all." The town's elite crowded into the small, dirt-floored cabin, weeping as the radiant thermal mass of the earthen walls began to thaw their bones. For 3 days and 3 nights, the wealthiest families of Oakhaven lived in the home of the poorest widow. They watched in absolute awe as she maintained perfect thermal equilibrium with just a few sticks of dry ash wood, while their imported modern machinery lay dead in flooded basements. They realized that true wealth is not the accumulation of complex, fragile things, but the mastery of simple, unbreakable laws. When the spring thaw finally arrived, Oakhaven was a changed town. The Victorian mansions were ruined, their plaster destroyed by burst pipes, their masonry cracked by the frost. But they did not order new cast-iron boilers from the city. They did not order more coal. Instead, a quiet, historic shift occurred. Mr. Sterling Pearson, Reverend Vance, and 41 other elite families swallowed their pride and approached Tamsin's door, not with mockery, but with profound respect. They asked her to teach them. Tamsin did not do it for charity. She became a sovereign architect of her own fate. She drew up the ancestral blueprints of her earth-bermed walls, the hydrophobic bark roofing systems, and the aerodynamic, flash-drying woodsheds, and she sold them. 43 elite families paid a premium for the architectural wisdom of a marginalized widow. The woman they had mocked for her $6 roof became the most sought-after master builder in the territory, securing a legacy of immense prosperity and unshakable respect for her children, all by proving that nature's laws will always outlast the arrogance of men. We live in a modern world that constantly tries to sell us complex, fragile solutions to natural problems. We are told that safety must be purchased at a high premium, and that the old ways are obsolete, savage, or foolish. But when the storms come, and they always come, the truth is laid bare. The machines will break. The grid will fail. The paper money will lose its warmth. And in that freezing silence, the only thing that will stand between you and the cold is the ancestral wisdom you carry in your mind, and the humility you hold in your heart. If this story has ignited a fire within your mind, if you believe that true independence comes from understanding the earth rather than trying to buy your way out of it, then I ask you to join our growing legacy. Subscribe to this channel, strike the like button to keep this digital hearth burning bright, and share this video with someone who values practical wisdom over empty prestige. And before you go, tell me in the comments below. From which city and country are you watching today? And if the power went out tomorrow, do you have the knowledge to keep your family warm? I am the storyteller of the forgotten. Until we meet again around the fire, stay humble, stay observant, and remember that the deepest roots survive the hardest winters.